Hi, I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
We both love and are fascinated by stories.
Stories about people
Stories about places.
and stories about events.
Our stories give shape and form to life.
They give texture, color, and rhythm to the blank canvas that every new day presents to us.
And they do that by informing us of our past as a directional marker for our future.
Okay, Will, it's narrative time. Tell me a story.
Today on the podcast, we've got Russ Greene. And Russ is the former director of government relations and research at CrossFit. He's a former games athlete, an Arabic linguist, and he's currently an associate director at Stand Together, a nonprofit in the DC area.
Well, hold on, Will.
Yeah.
I was a CrossFit Games athlete in 2007 and 8. Don't get any crazy ideas. You didn't even have to qualify back then. So,
I think, you got to put that up there. That's a big accomplishment, man. Even if you got in the ground floor, still counts, man. That's cool.
I mean, it was fun at the time, but
Russ, Will and I started, this is our 9th year. I guess Will started just before I did, maybe a few months. And I'm known as an old school CrossFitter. I don't know what that makes you.
oh my God, I started in 2002. So, yeah,
Wow.
I think it makes me old.
Makes you legendary. It makes you legendary.
I think initially I was at the point where I'd been doing CrossFit so long that it was embarrassing that I wasn't super duper fit. But now I think I've been doing it long enough that it's impressive that I'm still at it. You know what I mean? Oh wow, 19 years, still going. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome. That's so cool. Well, I'm gonna kind of mix and match these questions. So Russ, was that bio okay? Was there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, you hit all the big things, I guess. I'm
That'd be
sure
cool.
we'll get into more detail.
Very cool. And so how has your training kind of evolved over these past years?
So, oh wow, I don't even think that was on the outline you sent me. Well, wow.
Curveball at you.
I'm gonna go back. So
Okay.
2000. So I started working out in 1999, and I was going to the YMCA doing a machine circuit because I thought if I built more muscle, it would, I guess, help me get a girlfriend and improve my social status. It did neither. But I did get a little bit stronger, but doing the YMCA machine circuit gets boring after a while and it just doesn't work very well. So I started looking online for just new ways to work out. And about 2002, I found CrossFit. Now, meanwhile, I was a high school student doing high school sports, track, swimming, wrestling. And one of the things that appealed to me about CrossFit was it seemed like you could be in really good cardio shape from swimming or running and still just get gassed wrestling in 30 seconds. There wasn't a whole lot of, obviously there's some transfer, but it was surprising how tired you would get in a wrestling match, even if you thought you were in really good cardiovascular shape. And CrossFit workouts, especially in the beginning, feel a lot like that. It's that gasping for air, weight on top of you.
God.
Yeah. So, I for the first couple of years, I was mainly just using CrossFit just on the side. But, I happened to move to California just serendipitously. And that's where the first CrossFit gym was. So I started training there a little bit. And it was really when I was in college that I started, really getting into it more. I never really was a guy who, I think I'm going to make regionals this year and I'm going to train 7 hours a day. That was just never me, probably because I'm just not that talented. So it wasn't easy to delude myself into thinking I'd be the next Rich Froning. But I would say over the years, what I found is that you need to sort of go on these quests and you never leave behind the general physical preparedness, but every year or 6 months or whatever cycle makes sense to you, you pick something new that you want to work on and you lay that on top of your general work. And that's something that I've found works really well. So, whether I did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a while, till my wife made me stop because I kept getting hurt. I did a triathlon once. So right now I'm doing a lot of more like gymnastics, strength holds, and doing a lot on the Rogue Echo bike. But, just the whole while staying consistent. Like I never just went and solely did one thing.
Very cool. Very cool. So it's kind of like, finding like a new goal, something new and interesting to always keep you kind of engaged, apart from the GPP.
Yeah. I kind of stole the idea from a friend of mine, Brian Shantosh, because he would do these yearly challenges. Like one year, I think it was to row 1,000,000 meters. And then one year it was like as many rounds of Cindy as possible in a year. And I never signed up for any of these, but at the same time, I thought it was like, that's an interesting idea, a yearly challenge. So, like one year I had to do 10 SOTS press every workout. Like didn't matter what weight, just had to do 10 SOTS press, so just things like that. Keep it interesting.
That's super cool. And so I wanted to kind of transition a little bit. You wrote a piece on kind of modern life on Medium a while back, where you talk about kind of, health span, has our health span gotten longer, or, so it's always like this battle between the mathematicians and, the biologists, are people living longer? Or is it just, we're fixing infant mortality and we're getting better at, trauma surgery, things like that. Do you think there have been real gains in terms of, I guess quales in people's life? So just like maybe we live longer, but we live worse. Do you think that we're actually better off now than when we were, hunter gatherers and we'd all run and, run, a couple hours a day, run down some antelope and then eat it and, just hang out the rest of the time?
That's a great question. I personally would not like to go back to those days, but I will say this. I think the Steven Pinkers of the world, if you just listen to them and the numbers that they cherry pick, I think you get a very misleading impression. For example, when they talk about how conflict has decreased, well, there's a whole lot of statistical issues with that, like starting from, just the way they calculate the numbers killed in older generations of war. It's very hard to get an accurate count of how many people were killed 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And then, secondly, as Nassim Taleb has pointed out, these massive casualty events tend to fall, like they're fat tail events. Like,
gotcha.
I don't want to say black swan because they're not really, they're kind of
right.
But, so, hey, we've had a 75 or whatever it is year run without a world war, but there might be a nuclear Armageddon in our future within the next 50 to 100 years. Like we can't rule that out. So just to try to draw trends, based off of just like the past 75 years and then project that forward seems a little naive. I'm kind of butchering Nassim Taleb's argument, so definitely check out what he's written about that. That's one point. The other point would be like looking at the quality of life and health span, as you said. Clearly, there's been a massive increase in chronic diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancers. So the question is always, okay, we might be living longer on average, but how much of that time is actually spent doing what we want to do in a healthy state? Gotcha. So I was being intentionally provocative in my article. Obviously, I wouldn't, if I had the opportunity to go back and be a hunter-gatherer and press a button, I wouldn't want to. But I do think that the argument on the other side has been severely overstated and overlooks some pretty significant facts. And oftentimes it's portrayed as this romantic thing, like, oh, you're just like Rousseau, right? Like you believe in this noble savage. Like, no, I'm talking about real numbers, right. I'm talking about like a 6-fold increase in the number of people with type 2 diabetes, since the 70s. Like that's a real thing. I'm talking about 3 consecutive years of declining life expectancy, the longest consecutive decline in US life expectancy in 100 years since the Spanish flu. Like these things are really happening. But, on the other hand, you can't deny that there has been like massive, massive progress in other areas at the same time.
Definitely. That's a really good point. And, just anecdotally, if you go, so where my dad is sitting right now in Eastern North Carolina. So I'm in a metro area. Russ, I'm assuming you're in DC, so a metro area. If you
Yes,
go
sir.
out, like 20, 30 miles out in these more rural areas, you know, the downtowns look bombed out and the people look bombed out, the opioid epidemic, people are just, they're overweight. And there's all these kinds of problems where just health seems to have just declined over the past, I don't know. I have a short time span. I've been alive, so I can't, speak. But
Yeah.
anecdotally, it seems to be the case.
I mean, if you listen to guys like Peter Thiel, Ross Douthat, there's an increasing chorus of people who are skeptical about the amount of progress we've made in the last, say, 30 to 50 years. I think you could put me in that camp. I usually don't agree with the measures they recommend to fix it, but just, being skeptical about how much meaningful progress we've made in quality of life and length of life. Yeah, I think you could put me in that camp.
Super cool. And so kind of transitioning from that. So what's kind of the biggest misconception about diet and exercise that the layperson just gets plain wrong?
I think people don't understand the law of diminishing rates of return.
Okay.
Right. So it's an economics concept, right? But like generally the idea is the easiest 100 pounds to add to your deadlift are your first 100 pounds, obviously. Like 200,
Right.
300, it's going to be like 2 months. You're just going to learn how to do it. Boom. And 300 to 400, you might have to get a little more serious and start coming to the gym on a regular basis.
Right.
Still, it's not going to be that hard. 400 to 500, if you get there, that's going to take some meaningful training. And then
Right.
500 to 600, like strap in, man.
Right. Here we go.
Like unless you're really like genetically gifted or like a power lifter, like that's going to be a challenge. So it takes significantly more commitment and dedication and risk of injury and all these other things just to increase every additional unit. And that holds whether it's deadlifts, marathons, every single thing you could imagine. At the same time, there's not just diminishing rates of return to training, but diminishing rates of return to performance.
Interesting.
And what I mean by that is the first 100 pounds you add to your deadlift are the most important for your quality of life. Every 100 pounds you add after that transfers less, and eventually that curve turns negative, right? It turns downward. So eventually you're trying to add more weight to your deadlift and it's actually making your life worse. You can put a lot of powerlifters in that category, right? Or conversely, you take your mile from like 7 minutes to 6 minutes, fantastic. Even 6 minutes to 5 minutes, like that's great. Then you want to get down to like 4 flat, like we're talking like running 75 miles a week. You're probably going to hurt yourself. It's like, yeah, it's amazing, but unless you're a runner and you're getting paid to do that, or you're just like, this is the passion of your life, is it worth it? So I don't think people have put together that not only is it going to take more and more work to make each additional unit of gain, but that additional unit actually is contributing less and less to your overall life. And in fact, it will eventually become detrimental at some point, right? Like
Very interesting.
The guys who deadlift 750 pounds are not very fit overall, right?
Trade-offs. There's trade-offs.
Yeah. The guys who are, winning marathons overall are not very fit in an overall sense. Now, there are ways to like sort of try to game that. Like I think that CrossFit, one of the benefits of CrossFit is, like when you focus on more of a mixed modal type of performance, there's more of a linear relation, at least at first, between your performance and your quality of life. Like it's hard to say that you're going to be so good at Helen or Fran that, it's just making you unable to do the activities of daily life, or, like unable to pick up a martial art or learn a new sport. But at the same time, I still think there's diminishing marginal returns. So the reason this is so, like, this sounds really abstract, but like, I think everyone experiences this. Maybe they just don't have a word for it. Like the first 6 months when you're working out, it's amazing. You're PRing every single day, right? And then you keep doing that, whatever your activity is, whether it's CrossFit or weightlifting, whatever, you keep doing it over and over again and you're not getting the same results. And it's like people get frustrated or they push themselves too hard and they get injured. And if people thought more about diminishing rates of return, I think they would be able to think more logically about their training.
Super interesting. That's a great point. It's also, I think it highlights it's important to go do something and like show up every day and keep working at it, but not maybe obsess over, chasing crazy numbers and things like that.
Yeah, that's a mistake I've definitely made. Yeah.
It happens.
I think I've invested more time, energy, stress into exercise than I probably should have, given just like my inherent lack of genetic talent. Yeah.
Right. It's important to realize that. Yeah. That's cool. That's cool. So you mentioned, longevity dropping, the diabetes rate, 6 times. Is that what you said? Since 19?
Yeah, it's
sixfold.
Yeah.
A large number.
Who to trust, but generally it's like 2% to 12% of the population with diagnosed type 2 diabetes, as I recall.
Man, it's mind blowing. What do you think has gone so wrong? And how does the food and beverage industry kind of play into that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because you look at you listen to all these stories of decline, whether people are talking about stagnation in science and technology, they're talking about what they think's gone wrong with the economy, political discourse in America. Even you look at like Pew like polls Americans to see how much they trust various institutions in the federal government. And like since the 1970s, it's gone from like 80% to 18%.
Wow.
Like any story you look really in depth at the narrative of like when things went wrong. It's always like 1972 or 73, roughly.
Right.
And nutrition's the same. Like you look at the big narratives about like what went wrong. And it's like, yeah, they changed the farm bill for one. Obviously the farm bill is just this massive like crony mess of like subsidies and loan guarantees and quotas. And originally they were mostly paying farmers not to produce. And then Nixon, and I think it was 72 or 73, went from sort of a minimalist policy to a maximalist policy. So he basically wanted farmers to maximize production, and he was going to pay them to produce more corn, soy, wheat, etc., than they would produce under normal market conditions. So you look even at Marion Nessel's book, like Food Politics, and she really starts the story around that era in the 1970s. Obviously, you have the dietary guidelines happening around then. You have high fructose corn syrup really coming around. There's a bunch of, my point is, I would be skeptical of single cause narratives. It seems like a whole bunch of things happened at this, single decade. And then the type 2 diabetes and obesity rates just skyrocketed.
Craziness. And so maybe it's like, artificially cheap sugar. And, I know they've been dumping dairy because they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Things like that. So that's super interesting. So government policy may have played a role to a certain extent.
I mean, it definitely failed. You look at even the defenders of the dietary guidelines and they say, hey, look, don't blame the dietary guidelines. No one followed them. It's like, well, you may be right, but that also means they were an abject failure.
That's right. It doesn't change the fact. Exactly. They're wrong. Exactly. Not a super argument. So I want to transition a little bit and talk. So you've worked a lot with the on problems related to the NSCA and big sugar and the CDC and the NIH. What are kind of the most shocking things to you that you found, or that the average person just wouldn't expect? I guess.
Yeah, honestly, the most shocking thing I found is that Congress tells government agencies to do things all the time, and they just don't do them.
Really?
It happens all the time.
Really?
Yeah, like I just found this out the other day. Congress has told HHS on 4 separate occasions, hey guys, we really need a centralized disease surveillance database.
Yeah.
They've said that since like 2006. They even allocated funding for it. And CDC HHS kind of like convened a committee or something, but there's like 4 different Government Accountability Office reports saying like, guys, you never did this. You never even tried. Like, what's going on? and nobody cares. Because
wow.
it doesn't, like, this actually gets into what you guys are talking about. You know, like right now we have so much information, but people are blind to it because if it doesn't fit the single narrative that they can pay attention to at one time, whether it's blame the Republicans or blame the Democrats, they don't want to have any time for it. And the problem is the problems that we're talking about, whether it's public health agencies or, you know, obesity, diabetes, if you look at them on graphs, they don't go up during a Democratic presidency and then down during a Republican one. They trend in a negative direction regardless of who's in charge. So it doesn't really fit the convenient narratives. Like, for example, right now there's a lot of people upset about Trump's relationship with the CDC, and they're right to be. But if anyone's thinking that Biden's going to come in and the CDC is going to be suddenly a hyper efficient organization, I mean, it's not. Just look at the historical record. So one of the surprising things we found researching this was that CDC and NIH have foundations set up by Congress and partially funded by Congress that are nonetheless designated non-governmental. The British would refer to these types of organizations as quangos, quasi-non-governmental organizations. And they are not bound by Freedom of Information Act rules, first of all. And then second of all, what their function is, these quangos, is to raise money from outside sources. So like foreign governments like Saudi Arabia, or like corporations that couldn't donate directly to FDA or CDC or whoever, but they can donate to the CDC Foundation or the NIH Foundation, and it's not, you can't do a Freedom of Information Act request about it, at least not directly. And these foundations are required by Congress to annually report to Congress as well as to the public when they ask where the money's coming from, how much, and what it's being used for. And the shocking thing that we found when I was working for CrossFit is that they just don't do this.
Oh, wow.
And then we went to Congress and we told them that, and Congress asked them to start doing it, and they didn't do it. So,
oh, my God.
yeah.
Oh, God.
One more thing, because like people often say like, well, you know, you're just tracking the money. You're not proving that any actual fraud happened or things like that. We also found like a lot of discrepancies in their data. Like we noticed that every single time the CDC reported a disease prevalence like type 2 diabetes or obesity, and there was an independent group of academics that also looked at the same problem and tried to estimate a prevalence rate, the CDC number was always like off by like 25% compared to the independent guys. Always.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it was weird. You know, like in Florida, the CDC estimate of like the state diabetes rate, it was something like 29%, obesity rate. It was something like 29%. And then some independent researchers went and looked, and they just looked at medical records. They had thousands and thousands of data points. And they were like, yeah, the CDC's off by like 25%. Like, what's going on? And we found a similar thing with type 2 diabetes. Like Gallup's type 2 diabetes estimate for the United States, which by the way, they're calling up like 180,000 people, like super large. Yeah.
Huge.
It was like 14%, and the CDC estimate was 12%. And then you look into the CDC's data, and they have all these caveats like, oh, we're using data from 5 years ago, but just projecting it forward as if nothing's changed. It's like, you can't do that. You can't, like, we know it's changed. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. it's even more intractable than one would imagine, because it's not at the level of, you know, let alone, incumbency reelection rates are super high for Congress, even though our approval keeps going down, which is very interesting. But
Yes.
let alone that, it's at the level of the unelected bureaucracies. It's just like, what could you do? I mean, wow,
Yeah.
that's super interesting.
Pastor Collison has suggested that we just like break them up, like have like 10 NIHs, 20 of them. I think that would be a fun experiment.
That's hilarious. NIH 1, 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually in North Carolina, we had a pretty good idea. I don't know if this is actually the reason why they did this, but they moved the DMV from Raleigh to Capital, to where my dad's sitting in Rocky Mount. And, essentially 70% of the bureaucracy just quit. And so you get to actually rebuild. So maybe the answer is you just move them around. Just bye DC, hello Kansas City. I think Tyler Cowan actually has talked about that. But
yeah, there's some like budget reorganizations they could do too. But like I was looking at the CDC's budget, just thinking about COVID, and I was like, what percentage of their budget is going towards emerging infectious diseases?
Yeah,
I don't remember exactly what it was, but something like 10%.
Oh wow.
And you would think that would be their like number one thing.
The Centers for Disease Control.
Yeah, like that's what they were set up to do, right? Like initially to control malaria in the 40s, right? Yeah. And so why is CDC the one looking into vaping? Why is CDC the one looking into occupational hazards? Like, I'm not saying no one should study these things, but it's like, hey, focus on priority number one here. And clearly at this point, you can't say that, we can afford to get distracted, right? Like after the CDC COVID test didn't work for weeks, while the rest of the world's testing like thousands of people, and our tests just don't work. I mean, yeah.
It's bananas. And wow, yeah. And just for the listeners, yeah. So there's this whole debacle where the CDC was, no, we won't use anyone else's test. We're going to develop our own test for COVID, and then it didn't work, and then we're weeks behind, and then we end up where we're sitting now with 220,000 deaths.
It's an open question how much of a difference it would have made.
Fair enough.
I don't honestly have an answer to that. I don't really I'm by no means am I a COVID expert. It's just clear that, that's a troubling sign.
Yes. Something's wrong.
Yeah.
Something's very wrong when their primary function, they can't execute upon it. Super interesting. So moving from that, from the government side to kind of the corporate side, the food and beverage industry, is there anything people should be concerned about there, or any policy interventions you would recommend? I'm assuming you're fairly libertarian. You're talking to Tyler Cowan. I don't want to paint you as anything, but so I don't know what your policy recommendations might look like, but
yeah, I mean, I think you got to start with first, do no harm. So it's an open question, or it's a matter of debate to what extent the farm bill, farm subsidies in America are actually contributing to the problem. But let's find out, because right now the problem is we generally subsidize unhealthy food, corn, wheat, soy. And whereas something like fresh fruits and vegetables they're like designated specialty crops and they don't get subsidized. So that seems like a mistake. Beyond that, what worries me personally is how successful the Coca-Cola Exercises Medicine campaign was, because what it's really urging is the medicalization of exercise. And
can you mention what the Coca-Cola exercise calorie offset thing was?
The Energy Balance Network, is that what you're talking about?
Oh, sorry, no, I'm just Coca-Cola.
Exercises Medicine? Is that what yeah.
Right before that, there was because I remember in Walmart, I distinctly have this memory of in Walmart on all the Coke machines, they had these labels. It's like maybe it was like balance your calories or something, or it's like if you exercise enough, you can,
I think you're talking about the Global Energy Balance Network.
Maybe so.
Yeah, and that was, I guess, if I recall correctly, it was them trying to get a group of scientists together that would focus on energy balance as the solution to chronic diseases, which is an interesting thing because, like, obviously energy balance matters and getting people to exercise more would be a good thing. On the other hand, to give anyone the impression that that is sufficient, that would be misleading, because you can be normal weight and have type 2 diabetes. You can be a very active person and be pre-diabetic or have other chronic conditions. So it's not simply enough to exercise more if you're going to persist in a very unhealthy diet. The reason the exercises medicine stuff is more concerning to me even than that is that was really looking at merging the fitness industry and exercise in general into the healthcare establishment, like insurance billing and, you know, occupational licensure and all these regulations and, you know, getting third-party payment obviously involved. So that to me seemed like a disaster, and it still does, quite frankly. And first of all, I don't think it would work. I think if you look at the data, you know, just simply your doctor telling you to exercise is not very effective. Even paying people's gym memberships is not very effective, because, you know, if you take someone who doesn't go to the gym and then you give them a free gym membership, that doesn't make them suddenly start going.
Right. That's a whole other problem.
Yeah. So it's really sort of just corporate welfare for like whatever gyms manage to get into the system.
Planet Fitness.
Yeah. And then if you start thinking like, well, how would you actually really try to incorporate exercise into medicine? It probably would involve more of like a technological solution. And if you look at their papers, like the exercises medicine papers, they start talking about this where it's like, yeah, we want to include measures of physical activity in your electronic health records. And I think that starts getting into some interesting like privacy questions, because it's like we really want to require or strongly incentivize people to be uploading to the government or to a vulnerable, you know, IT system, you know, where they are and what they're doing at any point in time. And that doesn't seem effective either at the same time, because we know these devices that they use to measure physical activity just aren't very accurate, especially when it comes to like functional exercises, you know, like body. Let's say you were to do a circuit of like, you know, air squats and push-ups and burpees. Like your Fitbit has a very hard time, or whatever device you use, they have a very hard time actually calculating how much work you're doing.
Gotcha.
Generally, they're more effective when you're just like transversing ground. But, you know, if you're just like staying in place but working really hard, it doesn't know.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's where you talk about kind of wearables. I know you wrote an article on that. Yeah, it's super interesting. I know my mom, she wears like a pedometer, and she gets like $1 a day if she hits a certain number of steps back from the insurance company, which is like just kind of scary and bizarre. I don't know. It's just it's interesting to see where things go, especially if we ever get to single payer in the United States. You know, combine those two things. Seems like that could be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. So there's several trends going on that worry me, and I'm a worrier. So like,
it's good to worry.
Take my worries with a grain of salt, but at the same time, I am worried.
That's good.
So, you know, one of the trends is, as you said, towards greater centralization of healthcare. Another trend that's happening at the same time is, you know, as you indicated with that example, that insurance companies are getting more involved in monitoring activity, nutrition, lifestyle in general. And then thirdly, the technology they're using to do so is getting more and more intrusive. So they're developing devices now that are tracking like biomarkers, you know, like for example, they think that they can test your sweat and know your cortisol level, basically the goal eventually is to be able to know what's going on inside your body 24/7. And it's really the combination of those three trends that's concerning to me. If someone just wants to have a device and it's between them and themselves, or them and their doctor, and it's letting them know, you know, like, hey, I might be having something abnormal is going on with my heart right now. Like, yeah, sure. I totally get that. But when it starts becoming this centralized system, especially a government controlled system of, millions of people and their insides are being monitored 24/7. So we know when they're under stress, we know when they're using drugs and alcohol. We know where they are. We know what type of activity even they're doing. First of all, I don't think that's going to make people healthier. I'm skeptical on that end. Right. And then secondly, even if it were to, the privacy and government control implications of that to me are quite frightening.
No, I think that's a really good point. And you see in communist China everything they're doing with tracking people and using AI to really clamp down. It's super authoritarian and super scary at the same time.
Yeah, and COVID's kind of been like a convenient excuse for some of that stuff. Like you see people now using these wearable devices, supposedly to prevent COVID, but and these totalitarian regimes, like, does anyone have any confidence that, the use of these bracelets or whatever it is they're using is just going to stop once COVID's over? They're going to find a new reason to have you wear that, I promise.
Exactly.
So
keep it going. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we did recorded a podcast on. I worked in China for a little bit a couple of years ago, and we recorded a podcast on the Uyghur persecution in Western China, and it's insane to think about. Just what a government can do, and they kind of have that much power, and they know that much about you, and how easy it is to kind of flip that switch.
Yeah, and that's the flip side of like what we were talking about with the United States being in. It seems to me, if not decline, then in stagnation. The flip side is that the world's looking to China right now, I think, because they seem relative to us more like a success story, more dynamic,
right.
And that's a troublesome precedent.
Yes.
I don't exactly know what the right response is. The right response probably is for us to get our acts together first, right? Like,
right. fix yourself. Look internally.
Yeah. A lot of our problems seem to be self-inflicted, not China-inflicted, right?
Man, we keep shooting ourselves in the foot. It really hurts, man.
China didn't make us invade Iraq, and it didn't make us, eat 150 grams of sugar every day. That's for sure.
Right, but man, we're doing it. That's for sure. Super interesting. So I wanted to kind of, transition. Let me see. Pulling up my notes here. So now I wanted to I've got this little section, overrated or underrated. Have you listened to Conversations with Tyler before?
I have, yes.
Any chance? Okay, so I stole it blatantly from him. So if you want to just answer overrated, underrated, and give a brief explanation if you have one, I think that'd be super cool. So the first one is aerobic capacity.
Yeah. As it's commonly understood, overrated, just simply because there's so much skill and stamina involved with each specific discipline that the amount of transfer you get, say, from running to swimming or vice versa, is actually pretty disappointing. Like if you look at when Lance Armstrong went to run a marathon, he did well. Like he's a good runner, but like he was an hour off the best guys. And this is like, he's the best cyclist or one of the best cyclists of all time. And he was a very talented triathlete before becoming a cyclist. So, other similar examples, like Michael Phelps, his coaches wouldn't even let him run because he would fall down so much.
Oh my God.
So I think if by aerobic capacity, you mean that you think that by doing a single discipline, that's going to transfer broadly, I would be skeptical. However, if by aerobic capacity, you mean I'm going to train several different things and develop a broad base of aerobic capacity, that makes more sense to me.
Super interesting. Yeah, I saw this great study where swimmers' hearts develop differently than runners. They were just comparing swimmers and runners, and part of it might be what angle you're sitting at when you're exercising. But it's
a friend of mine was a state champion swimmer in high school, and he tried to go to the Naval Academy, and he couldn't pass their PT test.
Oh God, that's amazing.
he couldn't do the run under whatever the cutoff time was, a 1.5 mile run. And I think it was really slow, like 10:30 or something, 11, I don't know. And he just couldn't do it. And this guy swimming 3 hours a day.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, it's tough to grok though. I mean, that concept, that's very tough to grok. That doesn't transfer yet. David and I saw Chris Henshaw and went to an aerobic capacity seminar a while back, and he was like, "Yeah, you have to practice each thing individually because they don't transfer." And I'm just like sitting there like, "What?" Like, it really doesn't make much sense. But then you go try it, and it sure makes a little bit more sense.
I mean, that's a really sad thing about the CrossFit Games is like we genuinely thought that the CrossFit Games were going to help us discover like new ways of training more effectively.
Yeah.
And maybe it did that a little bit, but mostly what we discovered was, hey, if you want to get good at everything, you have to do everything all the time.
Exactly.
It's like, all right.
Oh, fine. God, no shortcuts, man. Oh my God. That's a great point. Oh my God. Anyway, so the next one I've got here is the paleo diet. Overrated, underrated?
Gosh, I don't know what
Say what it is.
Yeah, I think to me that's the problem with it. This happens to every diet. They get bastardized, right? Like they make the keto ice cream or the paleo donuts, and it's like the vegan brownies, whatever it is, and it's like the first year, whatever your diet is, it works really well for you. We're getting back to diminishing returns, right? And then figure out all the ways to like stay keto, vegan, paleo, and still eat food that's bad for you. And then you're like, why am I gaining weight? I'm staying strict keto, vegan, paleo. And it's like, well, I think you know why.
I think you know the truth.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. So what do you personally do now? What's your regimen look like?
Like for exercise or nutrition?
Nutrition.
Yeah. So my wife and I are in like this sort of death march where we stopped eating or consciously eating added sugar about 4 years ago.
Oh, nice.
And I must admit, I broke down once.
One time.
But I will not break down twice because she's never broken down.
Oh, God, yeah.
And that would just be shameful.
Yes.
So that is the main reason. I mean, and the thing is, Gary Taubes, who, he and I argue a lot, but one thing that he says that I think is very accurate is when you cut out added sugar, it takes a lot of other bad things with it. Right? It's hard to eat much processed food at all of any kind if you're not going to have added sugar, right? So even if the problem is overeating or too many calories or say, what are they talking about now? Like processed food oils.
Yeah.
All these things sort of go together because first of all, sugar is going to make you eat more generally. That's why they put it in food, right?
Interesting. So what, has it been hard to not eat added sugar, or at a certain point are you just kind of like, this is what I do?
I forgot who said it, but none is easier than some.
I definitely believe that. I'm a big believer.
Yeah.
Big believer in that. Very cool. Okay, let's see. The next one, the foreign policy establishment of the United States.
Oh my God. Okay, so I must admit, I used to be a neocon. So this is personal for me.
Okay, gotcha.
Because I know these guys and I fell for them and their lies. I would say they're highly overrated. I mean, just look at the record, right? Like, how many wars has the United States entered and like definitively won since World War II?
Oh, man.
I don't know, one maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, depends on what you want to classify as a war, but we're like 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5.
Not good.
And it's not just that you don't win. It's like, well, why are you even there?
Right.
What is it? Why have we been in Afghanistan since 2001? I mean, I could try to give you some reasons, but none are going to be very convincing, especially when you consider that this whole time we were sending billions of dollars to Pakistan, which was sending it right back across the border to the Taliban, which they were using to kill U.S. troops and Afghan civilians. If you read like Steve Cole's book, Directorate S, which is about the war in Afghanistan, it's hard to come away from that with any respect for the foreign policy establishment, because you got to remember, the war in Iraq became controversial. Even though, yes, Hillary Clinton supported it, it became controversial pretty quickly. But Afghanistan was like the good war for a while, even like 2008, 9, 10.
That's a good point.
And when you read what actually happened and what officials knew versus what they were publicly saying, and then you consider the fact that we still haven't gotten out yet, and that it's sort of like the default position in DC right now that we should stay. I mean, it's hard to explain. I mean, because it's like, okay, there's some terrorists there. Do you know how many countries there are terrorists in? We can occupy all of them, like
yeah, exactly.
Mauritania.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on.
Oh God. Oh God. Oh man. So, what do you? This befuddles me, and you've been connected more to this than you might have some idea about this. Well, what happened between so we rebuilt Germany and we rebuilt Japan. And we went in, we got rid of, the government and rebuilt the government, and they worked great. Iraq and Afghanistan, we have not been able to do that at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think part of the answer is that nation building probably just has a low percentage gain most of the time.
Gotcha. So we just got really lucky.
Yeah, but there's other people who just say, I don't want to call it a racist point of view, but they do tend to say that, well, Afghanistan and Iraq are not Japan and Germany. They're inherently underdeveloped or undereducated, civilizations or whatever. From my experience with Iraqis, that's not true. They tend to be very well-educated people. Their country was actually doing fairly well prior to Saddam Hussein.
Vibrant middle class.
Yeah. Even Afghanistan, like you look back 50 years ago, was doing pretty well. And Central Asia throughout history actually had some bright spots, like there was the Central Asian golden age, like Zoroastrianism comes from there. Quite a few important figures in philosophy and mathematics were in Central Asia. So, I don't think you can just write them off. Another explanation that people give is, artificial borders. And that's true, but like all borders are artificial.
Right.
Like God didn't design them.
Right.
So who do you think did?
Yes.
So have we lost some amount of state capacity? Yes, I think we have, but I don't know that we want to get much better at nation building. I think if we're going to talk about rebuilding state capacity in the United States, I think what we have to recognize is that we have a very high degree of state capacity. It's just been exerted towards the wrong things, right? Like the Joint Special Operations Command is very effective.
Right. Super effective.
Right? Yeah. The National Security Agency, they are good at what they do. They really are. Okay? We've spent 6.5 or whatever it is trillion dollars on the global war on terror. Like this idea, like the government just doesn't have any money or qualified people. It's like, no, we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. We've been, like not just the war on drugs that we've been doing, which has cost billions and billions of dollars. We're not just doing it in our own country. We're doing that in Colombia and Afghanistan and Mexico, all over the world, for no obvious reason. So it's less that we just lack state capacity. And I think it's more of a misallocation of resources.
Gotcha. That's super interesting. Yeah, it seems this huge shift when you look at the New Deal and everything we built the New Deal. I was just on the Blue Ridge Parkway and it's like beautiful, and they just carved it through mountains and all this stuff. And like now it's like, man, I can't imagine them trying to do this today. It would be quite expensive.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these rules now about how much you have to pay federal contractors, and there's all these, permits and restrictions and zoning laws. I mean, those things all definitely play a role, and I don't want to downplay them. But I also see a lot of the inherent problem of just like we turned our focus elsewhere.
Right, that makes sense.
If we were less focused on the global war on terror or whatever, or the war on drugs, we would have had to direct that attention, those monies elsewhere, probably internally. And I think we would have used them more wisely. I mean, it would have been hard not to have.
Right. That's a really good point. It almost seems like a lot of people and bureaucrats in Washington are interested in ruling the world more than fixing America, maybe. I don't know. That may be a weird way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I want them to try to fix America either. So.
Right. Fair enough. Right. Trade-offs.
But, at the same time, like, we were talking about the CDC's budget. Like, I wouldn't mind increasing the CDC's budget for, emerging infectious diseases, like even like 3 or 4-fold. Sure. I think that would make sense. We'd get a good ROI on that. But I think the problem is just mission creep in everything. You look at almost any agency, and whatever it was originally founded to do is usually just a small percentage of what it actually does.
Gotcha.
Like what percentage do you think of the defense budget is actually legitimately spent on things directly tied to defending the United States citizens?
Oh God. Hate to imagine.
Right? That's a problem.
Yep.
That's a problem. Yeah.
That's a big problem. That's cool. Super cool. So we got one more overrated or underrated. The CrossFit Games, overrated or underrated?
For who? That's my question.
Ooh, that's a good. That's a great.
For the health of CrossFit Inc. Overrated.
I believe that.
And I would say that because, look, I saw the books, right? And Tommy Marquez, Sean Woodland, they've talked a little bit about how, there were some possible deals on the table that could have made the CrossFit Games more profitable. I mean, they would have closed the gap, but they wouldn't have come anywhere near to accounting for all the expenses once you fully accounted for the expenses, right? I don't want to get into accounting too much, but like there's a difference between direct and indirect costs, right? There's the money that just the CrossFit Games spend, but then there's the amount that legal has to do to handle compliance, and then HR is doing to support the games. Like every department of the company is supporting them. And it ends up coming out to a whole lot. And then, the argument would be, well, it's bringing more attention to the affiliates. It's helping training. I think that's maybe true to an extent, but I also think that it came at a very high opportunity cost in terms of staff attention, time, and money.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. And also, so games are cool. Like I love the games, but it almost so kind of hurt because, when I'm trying to convince my 70-year-old grandmother that it would be great for her to go to CrossFit and like they'll work with her and she's infinitely scalable and, it would be really helpful. She's like, well, I saw it on TV and like these people, they're nuts, man.
Yeah.
It's Russ Greene up there on TV. Like, good God, I can't replicate that,
I'm on TV, guys. This is the second time I've had to correct your misconceptions.
That's right. Super cool. But that makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, I've heard that anecdotally as well. I've heard that, from affiliate owners. But, I got to say, like, I know some other affiliate owners that do say that the CrossFit Games help bring people in the door. What I would say, though, is that CrossFit over the past, 7 years faced some pretty significant challenges. And obviously, right?
Yeah.
It faced the challenge of bad press surrounding injuries, which, as anyone who's followed me knows, a lot of that was ginned up, through fake research, lies. But nonetheless, CrossFit affiliates had to face that people were coming or reluctant to come to their gyms because they thought it was dangerous. At the same time, if you understand the natural life cycle of disruptive firms, right, they have a huge advantage in the beginning because no one's caught quite on to their
to what's working,
special sauces, right? And then all the rest of the firms start imitating, right? So they buy the road gear, they even get CrossFit All-One trainers, they start running cross-functional fitness classes, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes a lot harder to maintain your competitive position in the marketplace. So CrossFit was really facing these two challenges. And I mean, what meaningful investments did it really make to counteract either of them? I'd be hard pressed, to say, like, obviously, yes, I was involved in trying to correct the record, but, it's not like there were ads reaching millions of people that were correcting misperceptions about CrossFit, or, there wasn't a massive overhaul of the training department to make sure that CrossFit trainers would have skills and knowledge that would make them like heads and shoulders of everything else available in the fitness industry. I think it's possible to do that. It would have been possible to do that because honestly, I don't have a very high estimation of the rest of the fitness industry. And I do think that within the CrossFit doctrine is it more than enough space for innovation and experimentation, if you think about the open source concept. But
Definitely.
like when people talk about the challenges that CrossFit faced, they usually start their story like 2 years ago. And it's like, no, you guys are giving us way too much slack. Like the problems, in my estimation, really started around 2013.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it seemed like maybe there's a branching path between the sport and, getting it to everyday people. Maybe a little bit. I don't know. And it seemed like there's almost a certain amount of saturation with high school athletes. So we got like everyone that was a high school athlete that can't anymore. And then like it's like, well,
glory days, bro.
glory days, right? Yeah, exactly. We've all been in the gym during the open. Friday Night Lights. That's pretty cool. Cool.
Yeah, the new guy, Eric. He seems to think that these goals are compatible. You might be right. I mean, he's a successful businessman. I hope I'm wrong. And, you can't say that CrossFit Inc. before did everything it could have to fully leverage the games. So, maybe there is a path forward that reconciles those two different objectives. But, I'm going to believe it when I see it.
That's smart.
Russ, I'm going to ask you to tell us more about, you mentioned an emphasis on the Rogue Cycle, Echo Cycle is
Echo Bike.
Echo Bike. Yeah.
Yes.
So what are you doing?
I realize that my competitive advantage in fitness is that I can literally do the same thing every single day and not get bored.
That's awesome.
I'm a creature of habit. Like, it's reassuring to me. Like, if I do 30 minutes on the Echo Bike every day, I am a happy person. If I miss my 30 minutes, I am a sad person.
It's that simple.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I'm not that great at learning new movements, and I'm never going to be the strongest or fastest guy. But if it just comes down to doing work every single day, the same kind of work, I'm pretty good at that. And obviously that has something to do with my, athletic background as well. Starting cross country when I was like, 10 years old, 11 years old, but yeah, what I've been doing is just 30 minutes a day, like a moderate pace. And then just once I can, and I track calories per minute. So I started at 11 calories a minute and would just check my heart rate at the end. And once I can consistently hold a pace and my heart rate's always like low at the end, like a 130, 140, below 150, then I bump it up either a calorie a minute or half a calorie a minute. And now so I went from like 11 to 13 and a half. And I'm just experimenting. Like, please don't hear me and think that like I found the elixir.
We got it.
Yeah.
We're sending David to 60 plus, next year. Got it, man. That's super cool. Well, I had one more question for you, unless Dad, you had any other questions?
It's just interesting because since I don't go into the gym with a lot of people at this point, primarily because of my age, what I went to was the cycle and started using that. And I do interval training, and it's based on fitness age that Wisloff came up with.
Yes.
And that's just, and I've done that before, and I really like it, and it seems to be very effective.
Yeah, a lot of people like the rower. I think the bike is better if you're a CrossFitter or if you do any sort of like a lot of lifting, a lot of body weight movements, because the rower kind of duplicates a lot of musculature and movements that you're going to hit elsewhere, right? It's kind of similar in some ways to an upper body pull, to a, like the lower back stabilization, kind of like a deadlift, a lot of legs, obviously. Whereas the bike is not just more dissimilar to other activities you're probably doing, but it also is at a higher RPM. Like rowing, you're at like 25, 30, at most like 35, 40 contractions per minute. So they're necessarily higher power contractions. Whereas on the bike, you're at 60, 65, 70, whatever RPM. So your muscles aren't contracting as quite as hard to do the same amount of work. And so I think it's more compatible, like as an addition, right? You're not going to over fatigue yourself. Whereas like, I think anyone who's like done a lot of Olympic lifting or deadlifting and then they try to row, like, unless you're really well adapted to that, that can be challenging.
Interesting.
Makes a lot of sense. Very cool. And I've got one more question for you, Russ.
Please.
So this is, I read all your journal articles in CrossFit Journal. What's your Fran time? What's your best Fran time?
Gosh, so I think it's either 249 or 251.
Nice.
Which, if you know CrossFitters, always assume the worst. So
Factor that.
Yeah. don't listen to me about that 249.
Super cool. Awesome. Well, Russ, we've had a ton of fun today. Thanks for coming on. Is there anything you'd like anyone to know about? Any links we can direct people to that might be helpful?
Yeah, if I said anything that didn't make sense to you, you can harass me on Twitter.
Oh no.
Greene plus an E. So GREEN plus an E on Twitter.
Perfect.
Come at me, bro.
Come at me, bro. Awesome. Well, thanks, Russ. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Will.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad. Join us next week for more narratives.